Hey everyone, I'm Austin, and tonight we're entering the realm of Morpheus, the god of dreams. He doesn't rule with thunder or fire, but with silence, shadows, and sleep. Every night he shapes our dreams, some gentle, some strange, and vanishes before we wake. If that seems peaceful, please reconsider. Is it everlasting to witness the unfolding of humanity's hopes and fears? It's a quiet kind of wait. Before we begin, tap like and subscribe if you enjoy this kind of storytelling, and drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, settle in, and let's drift into his world together. Morpheus rarely stands in the spotlight when people discuss Greek mythology, overshadowed by the grand Olympians who wield thunder and seas in their command. Yet, in ancient stories whispered around flickering lamps, Morpheus played a pivotal role in bridging mortals and gods through the subtle realm of sleep. He was neither a warrior nor a master of loud proclamations. Instead, he chose the gentle approach, weaving illusions, shaping dream landscapes, and occasionally planting cryptic messages that could alter the course of entire kingdoms. To understand Morpheus, one must first step back and recognize how the Greeks viewed the pantheon. They revered sky gods, underworld deities, nymphs of the forests and rivers, and lesser-known creatures who existed in the half-light of mortal awareness. Morpheus belonged to this latter category, operating in spaces easily overlooked by the mortal eyes. Where lightning bolts lit up the cosmos, Morpheus lit up the inner mind. His was the quiet magic of unspoken revelations. He was typically described as the son of Hypnos, the personification of sleep, whose children were called the Oniroi, or dreams. Yet Morpheus stood out even among his siblings. He had a unique talent, the ability to shift shapes and appear to dreamers in whatever form best conveyed the god's messages. Some tales characterized him as an ethereal being, pale, silent, and drifting through moonlit corridors, while others claimed he was a shapeshifter who took on human guises so convincingly that dreamers seldom realized they were asleep. In either depiction, he was seldom menacing. There was no need to frighten mortals into submission. A carefully placed dream could do more to guide or warn than thunderous commands from on high. Morpheus occupied a pivotal position at the intersection of cosmic power and human fragility. Since ancient times, people have wrestled with the enigma of dreams. Are they mere figments of one's imagination? Or do they carry coded messages from beyond mortal perception? The Greeks, with their flair for blending superstition and storytelling, believed that certain dreams could indeed foretell the future or reveal divine will. For such dreams to occur, though, there had to be an intermediary, someone who shaped the dream into a symbolic narrative. Morpheus stepped into that role with an artistry that rivaled the muses themselves. He was not a mere messenger. The deeper mythic threads paint him as a curator of experience, someone who wove together a dream's characters, locations, and moods. He chose which relatives you might see, which long-lost lovers reappeared to stir your soul, which undiscovered realms you'd traverse. If the gods wanted a king to spare a village or redirect an army, Morpheus could craft a night vision so convincing that the recipient woke up resolute in a new plan. When the pantheon wanted to remain secret, Morpheus could deliver an enigma, a riddle wrapped in dream logic that only the clever or desperate would decipher. Yet for all this influence, Morpheus is largely absent from the boisterous epics of Homer or the grand tragedies performed in Athens. You won't find him leaping into battlefield scenes or presiding over mead-soaked banquets on Mount Olympus. His domain lay in the stillness of late-night darkness, unnoticed by the wide awake. No chorus sang loud odes to him, but behind the scenes, he shaped destinies as surely as any decree from Zeus. That subtlety attracted a certain reverence among those who paid attention. Mystics, seers, and even oracles at Delphi sometimes acknowledged him as a hidden ally. They believed that whereas Apollo declared truths in broad daylight, Morpheus gently revealed them under the cloak of sleep. These characteristics made him neither a rival nor a subordinate, but rather another facet of divine revelation. To them, Morpheus represented the possibility that truth need not be shouted from temple steps. It could be softly breathed into the deepest recesses of human consciousness. In later centuries, references to Morpheus drifted into Roman thought, courtesy of the poet Ovid, who famously described him as the most gifted of the dreambringers. He was singled out for his ability to mimic any mortal form. This skill, so modest on the surface, hints at the potent capacity to influence not just thoughts, but emotions, a subtlety that immortals rarely mastered. Thus begins the history of Morpheus, a quiet god, half forgotten in popular retellings, but deeply felt whenever dreams unfold. He represents the art of subtle persuasion and the comfort of illusions, a figure whose real power emerges when eyes close and the ordinary senses drift into shadow. To appreciate Morpheus fully, we must understand the lineage that placed him at the nexus of sleep and dreams. In the primordial chaos of Greek mythology, enormous powers battled for supremacy, shaping the universe as they saw fit. Among these entities was Nyx, the personification of night, whose dark cloak stretched across creation. From her came Hypnos, the embodiment of sleep. While Nyx enveloped the world in darkness, Hypnos guided all living things to rest. For a mortal, sleep represented a nightly surrender, an act of trust in forces beyond conscious control. Hypnos dwelled in a silent abode rumoured to be near the shores of the river Lethe in the underworld. The stories describe it as a landscape untouched by sun or moon, draped in eternal twilight, with only the hush of the distant waters echoing through the halls. Within this realm, Hypnos presided over the Oneiroi, a whole family of dream spirits who ventured out each night through a pair of gates, one made of horn, the other of ivory, to bring dreams to mortals. The horn gate delivered true visions, while the ivory gate offered deceptive dreams. This distinction underscored the Greeks' conviction that not all dreams were created equal. Among these Oneiroi, Morpheus stood apart. His name itself conveyed a sense of shaping or forming, as if he acted as a skilled craftsman, meticulously shaping dreams. Some of his siblings, like Ixlus or Phobator and Phantasos, were in charge of different types of dreams. For example, Icelus was in charge of nightmares involving animals or monsters changing into other forms, and Phantasos could bring inanimate objects and natural elements. Morpheus alone possessed the gift to appear as any human figure, which made him invaluable whenever the gods needed to send a personalised message. He understood the nuances of human emotion, how to bring forth a familiar face to disarm a dreamer, or how to stage a scene that resonated with unspoken fears and desires. Morpheus's relationship with Hypnos was not one of mere subordination. While Hypnos embodied the abstract power of slumber, Morpheus took that raw potential and shaped it into narrative. Father and son thus formed a partnership of calm and creativity. Hypnos paved the path to unconsciousness, while Morpheus populated it with meaning. In a sense, they mirrored the idea that rest could be either empty or transformative. Under Hypnos, the mortal body relaxed. Through Morpheus, the mind roamed landscapes both familiar and surreal. It was said that Morpheus could slip past the notice of the Olympians themselves. In a realm dominated by displays of might, Poseidon's raging seas, Zeus's thunderbolts, Morpheus's power lay in subtlety. Gods might proclaim grand destinies to seers, but Morpheus brought his brand of prophecy, one couched in symbolism and open to interpretation. Any shift in a dream's plot, any cameo by a lost loved one, could spin fate in unforeseen ways. This quiet potential set him apart from other deities known for direct, sometimes violent intervention. In certain esoteric traditions, priests would leave offerings to Hypnos in the Oneiroi when interpreting dreams. Incubation rites took place in dedicated temples, where devotees slept overnight in hopes of receiving a cure or a prophecy from the gods. Morpheus played a starring role in these nighttime visions, sculpting experiences that might heal, warn, or guide, though rarely given the spotlight in epic poetry. His presence was keenly felt by those who sought divine interaction without the spectacle of oracles or the hustle of public ceremonies. Over time, as Greek culture spread and mingled with other civilizations, the concept of Morpheus evolved. In some local myths, he was depicted less as a subordinate to Hypnos, and more as an independent god of illusions, free to intervene or withhold as he saw fit. His fluid boundaries gave him a certain mystique. Mortals who believed in him imagined that their late-night revelations weren't random flickers of the psyche, but carefully tailored messages from a divine guide. Of course, skepticism existed even in ancient times. Not everyone believed in the significance of dreams. Philosophers like Aristotle treated dreams largely as mental byproducts of daily activities. Others dismissed them as illusions that lured people away from rational thought. But for those who embraced the mysterious, Morpheus was a comforting figure, a deity who shaped intangible narratives, either as gentle warnings or sources of unexpected inspiration. In this way, the lineage of Morpheus, the quiet synergy of night, sleep, and dreams, symbolized the Greeks' deep fascination with the unseen dimensions of life. Within the hushed intervals of slumber, it was Morpheus who held the keys to imagination, bridging mortal concerns and divine intentions through a world woven from ephemeral shadows. Unlike gods who clamoured for shrines, Morpheus often arrived uninvited, slipping into mortal minds without ceremony. But references to him do emerge if one sifts through fragmentary texts, second-hand accounts, and the poetic flourishes of authors who found meaning in the dream realm. Among these, the Roman poet Ovid left one of the most detailed portrayals, cementing Morpheus's image as a master shapeshifter. Though Ovid wrote in Latin centuries after Homer, his verses revealed a fascination with the intangible realms of dream, further interweaving Roman and Greek perspectives. In Ovid's Metamorphoses, Morpheus is one of three brothers, each responsible for different aspects of dreaming. But Morpheus receives pride of place as the one who can mimic human forms. When the gods, especially the goddess Iris, needed to slip a message into a mortal's mind, Morpheus would be summoned. He would take on the likeness of a friend, a family member, or a beloved mentor. The subtlety of his craft was its force. He achieved through gentle suggestion what thunderbolts could not. Mortals, awaking from these dreams, often felt compelled to act with a conviction that reason alone rarely mustered. Yet behind this skill lay an irony. Morpheus himself appeared in a few face-to-face encounters with mortals. A shapeshifter by profession, he did not sport a signature visage in the stories. He might show up as an old shepherd or a radiant youth, whichever best carried the god's intent. This anonymity magnified his mystique. Though recognised as a deity, he was simultaneously anyone and no one. Averse to dramatics, Morpheus seemed content to remain overshadowed by more flamboyant gods. Perhaps he recognised that anonymity was power. No one begged him for favours. No armies prayed for his intervention, and no temples were built where worshippers might harangue him with pleas. He did his work quietly and receded into slumber's twilight. That is not to say he lacked humour or emotion. In a few lesser-known stories, bards allude to Morpheus toying with dreamers, weaving in playful illusions. A tired traveller might dream of a lavish banquet only to wake up starving, cursing the false feast. A spurned lover might dream of reconciliation, only to awaken to the sting of reality. Occasionally, these illusions serve to teach lessons, moral messages about humility or gratitude, though they also reveal Morpheus's capacity for whimsy. Even gods, it seems, can entertain themselves with mortal foibles. His domain extended beyond mere illusions, however. Morpheus was said to have some sway over memory, a trait inherited through his lineage from Lethe's waters. While not as comprehensive as Mnemosyne, the titaness of memory, he could stir recollections long buried, bringing past joys or sorrows back into sharp focus during dreams. This occasional stirring of old memories sometimes acted as a catalyst for the mortal decisions. A warrior might remember a childhood promise and thus abandon the battlefield, or a grieving mother might recall the face of her lost child, finding solace or renewed determination upon waking. Crucial to Morpheus's influence was the fact that mortals rarely recognized his presence. They might blame the strangeness of dreams on a bad meal, or consider it a fleeting mood. Few realized that a divine hand had crafted the scenarios unfolding behind their eyelids. Those who did suspect a supernatural cause usually assumed it was a broad gesture from some Olympian, not the specialized artistry of a lesser-known deity. This was Morpheus's hallmark, to shape fates without demanding recognition. In certain Orphic traditions, the mention of Morpheus is accompanied by rituals intended to court beneficial dreams. People might write prayers or incantations, hoping for a vision that clarified a dilemma or revealed hidden truths. These rites were more private than the grand festivals for Demeter or Dionysus. They involved quiet petitions, often performed at bedside altars. A cup of warm drink, a simple token left under a pillow, or an inscription repeated before sleep might invite his favour. If results came, they were ephemeral, a dream that might fade by dawn, leaving behind only an inarticulate sense of guidance. Gradually, as Greek culture gave way to Roman rule, Morpheus's name and role adapted. The Romans had their pantheon, but they also absorbed Greek deities, translating them into Latin forms or merging them with local gods. Morpheus found a place in this cultural tapestry, aided by Ovid's literary gifts. His shapeshifting grew into an enduring metaphor for the power of dreams to challenge the status quo, to give mortal minds a glimpse of possibilities otherwise unreachable. That notion that something intangible could spark real-world change proved resilient. Even after temples crumbled and pantheons lost their worshippers, the idea lingered, quietly echoing whenever humans closed their eyes and wandered into the land of sleep. Beyond myths and poetry, Morpheus's influence took on tangible form in the dream-centric rites practiced in scattered regions of the ancient Mediterranean. Temple incubations, particularly those dedicated to Asclepius, the god of healing, are well documented. Supplicants slept in sanctuaries to receive curative or prophetic dreams. Though the official cult credited Asclepius with these visions, undercurrents of belief suggested that Morpheus or one of his siblings sculpted the dream imagery. In many accounts, dreamers would see Asclepius himself performing a healing act, but behind that divine mask might lurk Morpheus's handiwork, ensuring the dream resonated with the pilgrim's personal needs. Yet this indirect worship was as far as it went for Morpheus. No major city erected a grand temple in his honour. His name does not appear on long lists of civic gods who protected armies or oversaw commerce. In a culture that often prized the dramatic, victorious battles, epic voyages, monstrous confrontations, Morpheus's domain seemed too nebulous for large-scale devotion. Dreams were deeply personal, fleeting experiences not easily shaped into public festivals. This subtle presence, however, lent Morpheus a curious universality. He was accessible to everyone, king or peasant, without the need for elaborate ceremonies. A fisherman dozing by the shore might receive a warning dream about an approaching storm, courtesy of Morpheus. A farmer's child might glimpse a future bride in a fleeting reverie. Although such visions were unpredictable, they reflected a certain democratic aspect of his power. No mortal was too lowly or too exalted to receive a nighttime visitation. Philosophical schools took varied stances on dream deities. The Stoics viewed dreams with skepticism unless they aligned with virtue or reason. The Epicureans dismissed them as mental residue with no supernatural origin. Yet others, including certain Platonists, entertained the possibility that divine agencies influenced the soul during its nocturnal wanderings. Morpheus occupied a liminal space in these debates, neither firmly asserted nor fully denied. The complexity of dream experiences made them resistant to strict categorization, mirroring Morpheus's inherent elusiveness. In the everyday lives of ancient Greeks and Romans, dream interpretation became a small-scale industry. Travelling dream interpreters or local wise women offered readings, attributing cryptic images to messages from gods. Manuals like the Onera Critica by Artemidorus served as compendiums of symbolic meanings. A dream about a serpent might portend betrayal or healing, depending on context. While Morpheus himself rarely got explicit credit, these interpretive practices implicitly acknowledged a shaping force behind dreams. It was possible to feel the subtle touch of a divine hand in every strange or enlightening vision. Meanwhile, dramatists occasionally hinted at Morpheus's presence on stage. In certain tragedies or comedies, characters received revelatory dreams that set the plot in motion. Although playwrights typically invoked the major gods, Zeus, Athena, Apollo, some lines implied that it was a shapeless whisper of the night that delivered the dream. Audiences familiar with mythic lore would quietly attribute that role to Morpheus, even if the script avoided naming him outright. This indirect cameo suited his nature, a cameo in illusions rather than a direct spotlight role. As Roman influence peaked and Greek city-states became provinces within an empire, religious practices evolved. The cults of Isis, Mithras, and other deities from Egypt and Persia began to spread. Mystery religions thrived, promising spiritual experiences that mainstream rites did not provide. In these clandestine settings, where initiates sought personal transformation and glimpses of the afterlife, dreams were valued as a means of direct communication with the divine. Morpheus, though not explicitly worshipped, found renewed significance as a silent collaborator. Participants believed that their revelations during ritual-induced trance or sleep could unveil cosmic secrets, and who better than the gentle craftsman of dreams to facilitate those glimpses? Despite these evolving cultural currents, Morpheus kept his low profile. He neither clashed with up-and-coming deities nor demanded new reverence. Like a cameo actor in an ever-changing theatre, he adapted to shifting religious landscapes by maintaining the same core function. He shaped nightly illusions, passing along whatever message the dreamer needed, whether it was solace, instruction, or warning. Thus, while other gods experienced dramatic transformations or assimilation into new pantheons, Morpheus's essence stayed remarkably stable. His anonymity shielded him from the fortunes and misfortunes that befell gods tied to political power or public devotion. Through countless conquests, cultural fusions, and doctrinal shifts, he remained that discreet presence behind the eyes of sleeping mortals. He needed no marble statue or sacrificial altar, for his temple was the quiet domain of the human mind, a refuge where illusions danced, and destinies could be nudged without the constraints of daylight logic. As the classical world gave way to the Hellenistic era, and then to Roman dominion, Morpheus's relevance persisted in subtler, more eclectic forms. Scholarship in the city of Alexandria produced treatises on the dream interpretation that blended Greek, Egyptian, and even Jewish thought. Hermetic texts invoked the interplay of cosmic forces, sometimes alluding to lesser gods of vision and illusion. While these references seldom name Morpheus directly, they revealed a growing intrigue with the mystical dimensions of sleep. The more people tried to decode their dreams, the more they acknowledged a guiding power behind them. During this period, philosophers like Plotinus delved into the nature of consciousness. They wrestled with questions about the soul's movements during sleep. If the soul journeyed outward or inward, while the body rested, might it encounter spiritual beings or glean higher truths? Such speculation wasn't mainstream, but it held appeal for seekers disillusioned with state-sanctioned cults. Morpheus, while rarely cited, remained the unspoken craftsman of these interior voyages, the silent engineer behind whatever glimpses the soul might catch of a grander cosmic design. Meanwhile, poets, freed from the strict heroic codes of earlier ages, experimented more boldly with dreamscapes. They penned verses where protagonists navigated labyrinthine illusions or encountered fleeting apparitions, offering cryptic guidance. Although literary critics might argue, these poems reflected psychological depth rather than divine action. To many readers, the boundary was immaterial. Dreams were that liminal zone where mortal thoughts intertwined with supernatural influence. Morpheus, shapeless though he was, presided over that zone like an unacknowledged stage director. In everyday Roman society, too, the role of dreams took intriguing turns. Emperors occasionally claimed that certain expansions or decrees were inspired by divine apparitions at night. Augustus himself, recognized for his strategic cunning, was rumoured to pay attention to auspicious or ominous dreams, though officially, he credited major gods like Apollo. Citizens, hearing such stories, might privately wonder if a lesser-known deity like Morpheus had orchestrated these nocturnal briefings. After all, if the god of dreams could sway the mightiest ruler in the world, it underscored his quiet potency. As Christianity began to spread across the empire, attitudes toward pagan deities shifted. Bishops denounced the worship of multiple gods as idolatry, and an ascendant monotheism strove to replace the old pantheon. In this environment, minor figures like Morpheus faded from official discourse. Yet the phenomenon of dream visitation did not vanish. Biblical narratives contained their own dream sequences, Joseph interpreting Pharaoh's dreams, the Magi warned in a dream about King Herod. Early Christians recognized that significant messages could be delivered during slumber, though they attributed such interventions to angels or the one god. Morpheus, if mentioned at all, became a quaint relic of pagan folklore. However, among rural populations and within certain esoteric sects, older beliefs persisted in fragments. People might still light a candle and utter a small prayer before bedtime, not necessarily to Morpheus by name, but to the notion of a gentle force that shaped dreams. In personal diaries or in hushed family traditions, references lingered, testaments to how deeply ingrained the idea of a dream-shaping presence was. Over time, Christian mystics sometimes wrote about heavenly illusions or spiritual revelations received in dreams. Though they did not call Morpheus by name, the conceptual overlap was clear, a benevolent entity bridging the gap between mortal minds and higher powers, all while the world lay in darkness. During the waning days of the Roman Empire, barbarian invasions, economic turmoil and social upheaval threw daily life into chaos. Dreams, as always, offered either an escape or an omen. Morpheus might appear in scattered references, half remembered in local folklore or embedded in spells within the syncretic practice of magic. These spells, scribbled on papyrus or scratched into lead tablets, sought to harness dream power for love, revenge or knowledge. In some, the incantation invoked a shape-shifting figure of night, a shadowy being able to emulate any human form. The text might use Greek or Latin synonyms, never explicitly stating Morpheus, but the lineage was clear to those who knew their myths. By the time the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century CE, the tapestry of old gods had unravelled in public life. Grand temples stood empty, their rituals undone, yet the intangible realm of dreams persisted as a private frontier. Morpheus, whether recognised by name or not, retained his function. As centuries slipped by, he would shape-shift again, receding deeper into cultural memory. In occasional manuscripts or monastic texts, he survived as literary reference, an allegory for illusions or hidden messages that surface when reason dims. The twilight of antiquity thus set the stage for a Middle Ages in which classical gods receded but never vanished entirely. Like seeds buried under layers of history, their legacies lay dormant, waiting to surface when imagination or scholarly curiosity revived them. For Morpheus, all it required was for people to dream, a condition unlikely ever to fade. Explicit references to Morpheus become rare in medieval Europe. The academic class largely occupied itself with textual analysis and theological treatises as Latin Christendom shaped the intellectual and spiritual terrain. If at all mentioned, dreams were explained as the result of divine or demonic powers. Still, the classical corpus never vanished entirely. Though sometimes covertly, copies of Ovid's Metamorphoses were distributed in monasteries due to the church's conflicted view of pagan literature. Morpheus stayed a weird footnote in these books, a name a conscientious monk or a curious researcher would come upon and question. The handful who did study Ovid or other classical texts came onto someone who resisted simple moral classification. Neither was Morpheus a demon, nor did he fit Christian angelology exactly. Instead, he was a crafter of visions, free from ideas of sin or virtue. Sometimes this ambiguity inspired creative interpretations, particularly in the undercurrents of medieval allegory. Some writers suggested that Morpheus might be used to represent the illusions of the world, his form shifting a metaphor for the ephemeral character of worldly concerns. Still, these readings were occult rather than conventional. Greek philosophy was kept alive and developed in the Islamic world, meanwhile. Dream interpretation flourished in that field, thanks in part to customs derived from the hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad, but references to Morpheus, especially, were few. Still, the idea of a shaping dream creature echoed in mystical Sufi teachings, in which glimpses in sleep may transmit spiritual truths. Although the name Morpheus did not travel much in these writings, the agent who creates significant illusions stayed universal. Europe became quite interested in classical antiquity by the Renaissance. A fresh wave of humanism pushed the study of pagan literature. Scholars rediscovered old manuscripts. Artists found inspiration in Greek and Roman mythology. Morpheus revived in this environment. Poets started referring to him more freely, entwining him into allegorical tales about time, knowledge, and love, though their images differed, since the ancients never offered a consistent iconography. Painters occasionally portrayed him as a winged young man or as a delicate presence hanging over a slumbering person. Beyond intellectual and creative circles, Christianity and local mythology concerning dreams nevertheless affected the public imagination. Common people could talk of night hags or guardian angels, entities visited during sleep, but not so much of an ancient Greek dream maker. But at the courts of Europe, where educated courtiers flaunted their classical knowledge, a reference to Morpheus marked the speaker as well-versed in old stories, a sophisticated illusion. Sometimes masquerading writers of masques and pageaux personified dreams, calling them Morpheus for a little vintage flair. The printing press helped these illusions to proliferate more quickly. Ovid's translations into common languages brought the clever dream shaper a larger audience. Renaissance writers who loved stacking their works with antique themes grew to favour Morpheus. He represented to them the magical ability of illusions, the tempting attraction of imagination, capable of surpassing the physical world. Trusting the audience's increasing awareness with mythic connections, Shakespeare's contemporaries would call for Morpheus in stage directions or comic asides. Morpheus's nature stayed fluid even with this increasing attention. Unlike Jupiter or Venus, who had well-documented personalities and cults, Morpheus was defined essentially by function. This provided writers of plays and poetry freedom. One author would label him an aloof trickster, while another might write him as a kind mentor. Some works confused him with the whole idea of the dream world and attributed any nighttime vision to the arms of Morpheus. At least among the educated classes, this word even seeped into common parlance, a beautiful way to explain falling asleep and a monument to how completely the god of dreams was entwining with Western consciousness. The Renaissance also inspired fresh interest in sleep and dreams in science and medicine. Unprecedented rigidity in their study of the human body, doctors dissected cadavers to grasp physiology. Still, the character of dreams stayed mysterious. While some suggested dreams were the residue of sensory impressions, others suggested they were brought on by vapours or humours influencing the brain. For these newly arrived empiricists, the legendary concept of Morpheus as a physical dream maker was no more convincing. Still, the metaphor stayed with the writers and speakers. It caught something the scalpels and early microscopes could not. The sensation dreams emerged from somewhere beyond normal experience. So Morpheus lived in several worlds concurrently, as the Renaissance gave way to the early modern era. For academics and artists, he was a classical reference, a person who gave creative works depth and vitality. To the general public, he remained a rather obscure moniker, sporadically mentioned in sentences like "summoned by Morpheus," but hardly connected to any active religious practice. And to the rising ranks of scientists, he was a remnant of mythology, interesting, poetic, but inadequate in elucidating the real mechanics of the sleeping mind. This diversity of roles highlighted Morpheus's ongoing adaptability, a shape-shifting presence not only in the dream realm, but also in the cultural scene of a Europe undergoing change. The scientific, political, and religious upheavals of modernity altered people's perceptions of nature. A more mechanical or logical view of human experience was influenced by the Industrial Revolution, the Enlightenment, and later advances in psychology. Instead of being living elements of belief systems, the ancient gods appeared in this context as antiquated artifacts, curiosities for literature, art, or historical research. Despite his subtlety, Morpheus was no different. However, his legacy continued in surprising ways, subtly influencing contemporary cultural expressions and the human mind. The derivation of the drug morphine, which Friedrich Saturner called in the early 19th century after separating its active ingredients from opium, is one such example. By associating the drug's ability to produce sleep and dreamy states with the ancient god of dreams, he decided to honour Morpheus. Morpheus was elevated to a strange position by this scientific acknowledgement. He was no longer only a mythological character, but now had a real link to medicine. Ironically, the idea that Morpheus facilitated altered consciousness, albeit through chemical rather than divine intervention, was supported by morphine's ability to ease pain and induce visions. He was still mentioned in literature, though infrequently. Enthralled with the mystery of dreams and the human imagination, romantic poets invoked Morpheus as a metaphor of spiritual or creative insight. He appeared in Gothic stories during the Victorian era, occasionally taking the form of a character in dream sequences that made it difficult to distinguish between the real and the fantastical. The power of dream imagery was rediscovered in the 20th century by surrealist painters and fantasy authors who occasionally used Morpheus as a thematic device. Even comic book creators found him to be a fascinating character. Neil Gaiman's The Sandman series, for example, depicted a modern reinterpretation of Morpheus, albeit it was more influenced by modern fantasy than by rigid classical myth. Meanwhile, under the leadership of individuals like Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud, psychology became a recognised field of study. They conducted in-depth research on dreams, examining their symbolic meaning and unconscious function. Jung's idea of archetypes allowed for the recognition of mythic characters as expressions of universal psychological patterns, but Freud rejected direct allusions to dream deities. Despite being infrequently mentioned in clinical discourse, Morpheus personifies some mythological features, such as the shape-shifting messenger who connects the conscious and unconscious domains. Speaking poetically, one could imply that, even if they employ different language. therapist and patient are really tiptoeing over Morpheus's territory whenever they engage in dream interpretation. Outside of academics, the phrase "the arms of Morpheus" is still used in casual conversation as a charming way to describe someone who is falling asleep. Morpheus is sometimes used by songwriters as poetic shorthand for illusions or dreamy situations. Characters in plays or movies may joke that they were taken by Morpheus when they are particularly exhausted or have bad dreams. As a result, the god's name endures in popular culture, reflecting a persistent interest in the transitional realm between the fleeting theatre of dreams and the real world. Morpheus was occasionally likened to comparable dream figures in other traditions, gods, spirits or ancestors. Credited with forming nighttime visions, as religious plurality increased and audiences for myths from around the globe expanded. Morpheus has occasionally attracted followers in some New Age and neo-pagan societies, which revive ancient pantheons for individual spirituality. These contemporary practitioners might view him as a lucid dreaming guide, or an ally in creative inquiry, creating a personal bond that somewhat reflects the age-old practice of looking for important dreams. Naturally, such varied revivals do not dominate popular belief, but they highlight Morpheus's versatility throughout history. He continues to serve as evidence of the human need for a go-between for conscious awareness and the innermost parts of the mind. The appeal of a guiding figure endures even at a time when sleep labs and neurology are used to analyse dreams, the subjective landscapes that play out in our minds every night. After all, cannot be completely mapped by any technology. Therefore, Morpheus persists as a cultural shapeshifter. Initially a minor character in Greek mythology, he was crucial in bridging the gap between mortal life and divine aims, while being overshadowed by Olympians. He withstood scientific breakthroughs, religious upheavals, and conquests throughout millennia. He found new homes in literary flair, psychological metaphor, and medical terminology. He now represents that satent, all-encompassing enigma, the dream realm where we face self-revelations, delusions, and reflections of ourselves. Despite being elusive and infrequently worshipped in official ceremonies, Morpheus never fails to arouse our imaginations by serving as a reminder that sleep is more than just a place to rest. It is a doorway, thoughtfully crafted by a being who doesn't require a temple to demonstrate. And now the dream dissolves. Morpheus retreats back into the folds of night, his hands empty once more, waiting for the next soul to guide him into sleep. Thank you for letting me take you there. Rest deeply, dream gently, and may sleep wrap you in the softest silence. Until next time, good night. From the vantage of old Macedonia, where elders gathered beneath olive trees to swap hushed lore, the story of Hercules emerged in sparks of disbelief. They whispered about a force that blurred the boundaries between the mortal and divine realms. This child, born in modest Tiryns, possessed an unsettling gift. Feats of strength performed so calmly that some wondered if the gods had quietly laid a blessing or a curse at his feet. Tiryns was a farming community framed by rocky hills and cloud-strewn skies, a place defined by the routine labour and rigid social caution. The boy's first display of uncanny power was witnessed by a shepherd. With a single tug, he reined in an ox known to drag grown men like ragdolls. It wasn't the show of force itself that troubled onlookers. It was the eerie silence with which he did it, as though testing a boundary rather than revelling in might. Soon, neighbours recalled other oddities, doors unhinged by a careless push, footprints left in stone, and animals that yielded to his hand without resistance. Though some saw him as Tiryns' protector in training, others felt uneasy. Mortals were fragile beings. Gifts of such magnitude often drew divine ire. Hercules, for his part, behaved like any curious youth, combing riverbanks for turtles or carving shapes into the soft rock. Yet beneath each childlike pastime lurked an awareness of difference. He sensed that the world around him fit like a shirt one size too small, familiar but constricting. A single miscalculation could fracture relationships or destroy trust. As he neared 15, rumours of unnatural predators swept across the farmland. Shepherds muttered of wolves the size of ponies, with eyes lit by feral intelligence. The local militia dared not test the truth of those claims, leaving the fields in a state of hush. Hercules, compelled by equal parts curiosity and duty, gathered a simple spear and ventured into the pine forests alone. For 3 nights, the darkness swallowed him. On the 4th dawn, he reappeared at the village edge, clothes torn, blood running down his arms. Yet he carried no trophy, only the quiet certainty that the threat was gone. Word of his deeds spread through travellers' wagons and along shepherds' routes, echoing into lands beyond. It was said that the monstrous wolves vanished as swiftly as they had come. In the villagers' eyes, such might have signalled a guardian, or even a chosen instrument of the gods. Soon they built humble altars to honour him. They offered tiny bowls of grain and small cups of wine as offerings to the boy who had ensured their nights. Hercules accepted none of it openly. He would pause at those altars, gaze at them in faint puzzlement, then slip away. Inside him, a tug of longing clashed with the weight of expectation. He cherished the farmland's rhythms, morning light over tilled earth, the lull of cicadas in the summer. Yet each casual greeting now carried a jolt of awe, and every dirt path he roamed felt narrower, as though funneling him towards some vast unseen road. Occasionally, he stole into the hills to commune with nature's raw pulse, pressing his broad hands against boulders as though listening for whispered secrets of stone. Tiryns was never the seat of sophistication, unlike Athens or Thebes. It lacked gilded temples and philosophical gatherings. In a way, the simplicity of Tiryns allowed Hercules to flourish without being overwhelmed by rumours. People accepted him, half wary, half hopeful, because they needed him. He held back storms that might devour them in a single gulp. He soon learned of a summons from King Eurystheus of Mycenae, a monarch who demanded fealty and recognised the usefulness of a mortal wielding near-divine might. Friends warned him of palace politics. Even the local priest, stooped with age, cautioned that power-hungry rulers often feed on legends until there is little left of the legend itself. However, Hercules sensed an unspoken reminder that a simple shepherd's life would never be his. Gathering sparse belongings, he took one last look at the farmland, the lopsided fences, the distant bleating of goats that once filled his childhood mornings. Then, as dawn's first gleam touched the horizon, he set out for Mycenae. Those who witnessed his departure claimed a hush fell upon Tiryns, like the land itself held its breath, waiting. The path he walked would lead to triumph and sorrow, forging a destiny both luminous and shattering. In his heart, Hercules hoped to find a way back to quiet fields someday, but deep down, he suspected the gods had other plans entirely. The road to Mycenae stretched through rolling plains dotted with olive groves and jagged hillsides. Hercules travelled quietly, observing the land more than pondering the future. Yet he couldn't ignore the murmur that followed him, a hum of anticipation carried by traders, roadside shepherds, and vagrant bards. Upon arrival at the fortified city, he faced a spectacle: drummers at the gates, banners hoisted high, and crowds craning to see if a rumour exceeded reality. King Eurystheus' palace gleamed atop a rise of white stone. Once inside, Hercules found himself before a ruler whose thin lips twitched at each mention of his name. Despite grandiose surroundings, Eurystheus exuded an air of self-importance, undermined by a hint of anxiety. In the hushed court, courtiers eyed Hercules with an odd mix of curiosity and caution. They had heard the rumours of unstoppable strength. Now they assessed the man himself, broad-shouldered, wind-beaten, eyes calm as still water. Eurystheus wasted no time. "Word of your deeds has travelled far," he said, feigning warmth. "To prove your loyalty, you shall fulfil labours for the glory of Mycenae. And the gods, of course." Applause followed from courtiers, though it felt forced. Hercules bowed, not out of fear, but recognising that refusal would brand him an enemy of a kingdom that seemed both powerful and petty. Besides, he sensed destiny's nudge again, that intangible force hinting these labours might shape his future. His first assignment, the Nemean lion. Villagers near Nemea spoke of a cat the size of a warhorse, its fur impervious to spears or arrows. Eurystheus demanded its pelt as proof. Setting out with minimal supplies, Hercules ventured into a region shadowed by tall grasses and jagged rock. On the second day, he spotted massive paw prints pressed into the soil. Following them, he entered a dank cavern overhung by dripping vines. The lion emerged, its coat shimmering like steel. Arrows snapped against its hide, confirming the rumours. They grappled, the beast roaring with unnatural ferocity while Hercules wrestled in silence. locking powerful arms around the creature's neck. At last, he wrenched it downward, ending its life with a blow that reverberated in his bones. No victory cry escaped his lips, only relief. He skinned the lion with its claws and then draped the pelt over his shoulder. When he returned, Eurystheus balked at the sight of that massive trophy. Commanding the city gates shut, he insisted Hercules remain outside due to displaying future conquests from a distance. Thus began a curious ritual. Each time Hercules completed a labour, the king would peer down from the safety of high walls, making excuses to avoid direct contact. The champion, calm in compliance, never argued. He found no pride in forcing an audience. Fulfilling duty was enough. Shortly after, he faced the Lernaean Hydra, a serpent with 9 heads that regrew if cut. Hercules approached the swamp of Lerna, its murky waters stinking of rot. He attacked, but each severed head sprouted 2 more, only with the help of his nephew Iolaus, who cauterized each stump with torchlight. Did Hercules triumph. Lifting the central head, still hissing in death, he returned to Mycenae. The king, peering over parapets, dismissed the victory. "You had help," he sneered, yet the people watching from afar marvelled. Labourers mounted. The Cyrenaian hind, sacred to Artemis, tested his finesse. He chased it for a year across forests and streams before cornering the golden-antlered creature. Rather than slay it, he merely captured and displayed it, then set it free, earning grudging respect from the goddess. He subdued the Erymanthian boar, bringing it back alive. After each feat, Eurystheus found reasons to belittle it. Still, word spread, forging Hercules' name into a legend that outgrew even the king's attempts to contain it. Hercules tasked with cleaning the Augean stables, an impossible mass of filth left for decades. Diverted 2 rivers in a single day, washing away the grime and exposing the stable's owner, Augeas, for his dishonesty. Along the way, the hero recognized these tasks weren't simply chores from a cowardly king, they served as rites of passage. Each labour illuminated facets of responsibility, cunning and mercy. Yet Hercules also sensed a growing gulf between himself and normal life. Day by day, the realm saw him less as a man and more as a living weapon. Behind the feats and rumours loomed an unspoken shadow. Stories hinted he was atoning for a private tragedy caused by a divine curse. He carried that burden silently, forging ahead on a path paved by others' demands. In fulfilling each new labour, Hercules grew ever more certain that his real battle lay within, a test to see whether monstrous foes or guilt from a past soaked in blood would claim him first. Over time, Eurystheus' list of labours seemed an endless well of peril. Some missions exuded a sense of malice, as if the king aimed to eliminate Hercules by challenging him to confront real-life nightmares. Yet it wasn't the magnitude of tasks that hollowed Hercules' spirit. It was the sense that each success fueled the king's resentment. Mycenae now revered a champion who strode in only to drop proof of another victory before vanishing again. At dawn one day, a messenger gasping for breath approached Hercules outside the city walls. A threat lurked by Lake Stymphalus, where ravenous birds terrorized farmers. Their iron-like feathers cut flesh, and the beating of their wings filled the sky with a menacing clang. Stymphalian birds were rumoured to be spawn of an ancient curse, feasting on anyone who strayed near the marsh. Eurystheus' decree was terse: exterminate them. Travelling to the lake, Hercules found the marshland choked with tall reeds and stagnant water. At dusk, he glimpsed shadowy shapes perched in twisted trees. Arrows alone wouldn't suffice. For every creature he felled, others scattered into the gloom. Recalling an old tale, he fashioned bronze clappers, forging a racket so loud it startled the flock skyward. As they took flight, he shot them down systematically. Their carcasses drifted into reeds, painting the swamp red under the waning sun. The few that escaped took the legend of this unstoppable archer with them. More labour followed. Fetching the Cretan bull, a massive beast rumoured to breathe fire, brought him face to face with an animal maddened by captivity. Rather than slay it, he subdued it and brought it to Mycenae, only to watch Eurystheus cower behind the gate. Later, capturing the mares of Diomedes required wrestling savage horses bred for violence. Some say Hercules fed Diomedes to his mares in a moment of grim poetic justice, ending their thirst for human flesh. Yet it was an act that left Hercules uneasy. Dispatching a tyrant solved one evil, but the memory haunted him. What lines separated righteous punishment from barbarity? In these wanderings, he discovered people who welcomed him as a living legend, yet recognized his underlying melancholy. Children peered around corners, hoping to see the giant who wrestled monsters. Old men offered wine, praising him as champion of the downtrodden. Occasionally, Hercules paused to help build a wall or fix a broken roof, acts of normalcy that anchored him to everyday life. But the moment always came when a new labour call or a rumour of a monstrous threat demanded his presence. At night, he grappled with nightmares. The unwritten story behind his forced servitude gnawed at him, a rumour that he'd once been driven crazed by Hera's wrath, causing him to commit unspeakable deeds against those he loved. Although few dared mention it aloud, the weight of that guilt never left his eyes. Even the unstoppable Hercules could not outrun sorrow that sprang from within. Eventually, Eurystheus delivered yet another test, to steal the girdle of Hippolyta, queen of the warrior women known as Amazons. In a land beyond the Aegean, Hercules came upon a culture of disciplined fighters who lived independent of typical patriarchal laws. Initially, Hippolyta welcomed dialogue, impressed by rumours of a hero who balanced power with compassion. She considered granting him the girdle as a diplomatic gesture, but Hera, ever meddlesome, spread deceit among the Amazons, whispering that Hercules planned to abduct their queen. In the ensuing chaos, swords clashed, alliances shattered, and Hippolyta fell. Dying, she handed the girdle to Hercules, her expression etched with betrayal and sorrow. He departed with the prize, cursing the gods who twisted every peaceful solution into conflict. This pattern of tragedy bled across each mission. The more he accomplished, the less solace he found. The blame was easily laid at Eurystheus' feet, but Hercules understood that the seeds of discord came from the gods themselves, and from his heart, burdened by regrets. No monstrous hydra or invulnerable lion caused him as much pain as the memories he couldn't erase. Each labour, though celebrated by others, felt like an extension of penance. Still Hercules pressed on, partially out of duty and partially from an instinct that stopping might let darker forces run rampant. He was no politician, no orator, but people believed in him, and in their belief, he found a reason to shoulder his tortured past. So he continued, forging alliances with honest souls, meeting cunning foes in remote lands, and slaying nightmares so ordinary folk could rest at night. Through scorching deserts and perilous seas, Hercules roamed like a wandering guardian. His reputation derived more from his deeds than his words. Even so, a question circled endlessly in his mind. Would saving the world ever wash away the blood on his conscience, or was he doomed to carry his haunted legacy until the end? As the labours approached their conclusion, Hercules observed a change in the political landscape. Mycenae's commoners adored him, weaving new songs about his might, but the court seethed with jealousy. King Eurystheus, cornered by his decree, pressed onward with increasingly brazen demands. He ordered Hercules to journey to the far edges of the known world. Some suspected the king hoped the hero would never return, sparing him the embarrassment of living in another man's shadow. A test soon arrived in the form of the cattle of Geryon, the creature Geryon, rumoured to have 3 bodies fused into one, reigned over a sun-scorched land beyond the pillars marking the westernmost boundary of mortal travel. The prize, a herd of crimson cattle prized by gods and kings alike. Hercules set off, crossing mountain passes, scorching deserts, and nameless seas. He famously split a landmass to create a strait, some said in a moment of frustration, others as a statement of power, raising what would later be called the Pillars of Hercules. He eventually arrived at Geryon's domain, where a monstrous hound guarded the cattle. Battling Geryon demanded strategy, for each torso wielded a different weapon. Hercules exploited the confusion, striking while the giant struggled to coordinate his 3 minds. With Geryon slain, he herded the cattle through hostile territories, clashing with thieves and hostile kings along the way. His triumphant return to Mycenae, driving those surreal red-hided animals, caused a stir of both admiration and dread. Yet Eurystheus welcomed him only from a safe distance. Soldiers corralled the cattle, sacrificing many on Eurystheus's orders. The more the king tried to belittle Hercules' efforts, The more ordinary citizens hailed the hero as a saviour of the realm. Privately, Hercules remained unmoved by their cheers. Each new conquest carried echoes of moral conflict, as if he were a blade used by manipulative hands. Another monumental feat involved the golden apples of the Hesperides, guarded by a serpent coiled in a hidden orchard. Tales said the apples conferred immortality, though most mortals never reached the far-flung garden. Hercules travelled for months, uncertain if such a place truly existed. Eventually he encountered Atlas, the titan condemned to hold the sky on his shoulders. Seizing an opportunity, Hercules offered to take that cosmic burden temporarily if Atlas would fetch the apples. Atlas retrieved them, but then tried to abandon Hercules, hoping to free himself from eternal torment. Through a cunning ploy, Hercules tricked Atlas into reclaiming the heavens, walking off with the fabled fruit. When he presented the golden apples to Eurystheus, the king had no idea what to do with them. Legend says Athena herself intervened, returning the apples to their rightful place. In that moment, Hercules glimpsed the gods' casual involvement. They toyed with mortal affairs, granting fleeting favours or curses, shaping destinies as one might shuffle coins. He realised that each labour was less about Eurystheus' commands and more about the gods' inscrutable agenda, and his path of atonement. Only one task remained: descending into the underworld to capture Cerberus, the three-headed hound of Hades. This final labour surpassed mortal limits, for no living soul dared approach that dismal realm without invitation. Hercules ventured down the dark corridors of the earth, guided by wailing spirits and the unrelenting pull of cosmic gloom. Before the throne of Hades, he offered to wrestle Cerberus bare-handed if permitted to bring the beast to the surface. The god of the dead consented, more amused than alarmed. Their struggle was fierce. Each of Cerberus's heads snapped and snarled, snake-like tails lashing in fury. Yet the hero subdued the beast, hauling it above ground to Mycenae's gates. When Eurystheus saw the snarling hound of death, he hid, trembling behind his walls. Hercules, mission done, gently returned Cerberus to Hades. With all labours completed, Hercules stood outside Mycenae's walls, eyes on the fortress that had dominated his life. He expected neither thanks nor release, for he understood his service wasn't to Eurystheus but to something deeper. Turning from the city, he felt both emptiness and freedom. He had conquered beasts and braved terrors unknown to mortal men. Now, the question loomed: could he conquer the shadows that clung to his heart? He walked away, the crowds uncertain whether to weep at his departure or celebrate their king's deliverance from jealousy. Quietly, Hercules carried with him the echoes of every monstrous roar, every anguished cry, forging a destiny severed from royal commands but still bound by the gods' inscrutable design. Released from Eurystheus' demands, Hercules drifted. Some claimed he roamed until he found a remote valley, building a modest home beside a sparkling brook. There, he tried to cultivate olives and vine crops, as though seeking normalcy. Villagers in the vicinity grew accustomed to spotting a giant figure mending fences or hauling timber. For the first time, he blended into daily life, if only briefly. Yet tranquility proved elusive. Strangers arrived, testing the legend. Some wanted to measure strength against the famed demigod, brandishing swords or arrogant boasts. Others offered alliances steeped in hidden agendas. Hercules repelled them, but each confrontation frayed the delicate peace. Rumours circulated about a new champion who might best him, and with each rumour came another challenger. Tiring of this drama, Hercules took to the road, relinquishing the valley to preserve its calm. He wandered from city to city, forging a reputation as a roving problem-solver. In Attica, he drove away raiders who preyed on vulnerable farms. In Aetolia, he mediated disputes among tribal leaders too proud to seek peace themselves. Some towns offered him gold or titles, but he refused, yearning for something intangible that mortal wealth couldn't provide. Whispers of his identity preceded him. Children recited his labours as bedtime stories. Local bars named beverages after him, and travelling minstrels twisted details for dramatic flair. Along the way, Hercules encountered Deianira, a woman said to possess both keen intellect and resolute compassion. She saw through the aura of legend, urging him to confront the guilt that shadowed him. Her strength of spirit matched his physical might, and their bond blossomed into love. For a while, he believed he might carve out a life of shared purpose, perhaps leading a small settlement or teaching others to defend themselves without tyranny. They married, weaving fresh hopes into days that felt gentler, yet the old cycles returned. One evening, while travelling together, they encountered the centaur Nessus at a river crossing. Nessus offered to ferry Deianira across the water, but partway he revealed his intent to abduct her. Hercules, swift to act, let an arrow fly, its tip laced with hydra poison. The wounded centaur collapsed, blood soaking the shore. In his final breaths, he whispered deceit to Deianira. Should she ever fear losing Hercules' love, a garment stained with his blood would bind him to her. Moved by desperation, she gathered some of that blood, too distraught to see the trap. Life continued. Hercules continued to be a wandering force, with Deianira either by his side or anxiously waiting at home. Over time, she worried about rumours of his infidelity. Travelling the world exposed him to temptations, and his legend drew admirers of every stripe. In a moment of fragile insecurity, she recalled Nessus's final words. She treated a robe with the centaur's blood, believing it a charm that would secure Hercules' devotion. When Hercules donned it, the old poison ignited like living fire, adhering to his flesh. He tore at the fabric, but the agony only worsened, ripping his skin away. Realizing the horrifying betrayal, he raged in confusion, not knowing the entire truth of why the robe burned him alive. Faced with the insurmountable pain, he sensed no earthly remedy could quell it. Deianira, horrified by what she had caused, either fled or took her life. Accounts differ. Hercules, in his torment, built a funeral pyre on Mount Weta. Step by tortured step, he climbed, each footfall echoing the weights he'd carried all his life. Guilt, duty, heartbreak. He stretched himself upon the wood, begging for an end to his suffering. Flames were lit, devouring mortal flesh that once battled monsters and kings. Smoke curled toward the sky, bearing the essence of a hero who had saved entire realms yet failed to escape divine cunning and human frailty. Some say that in those final moments, Zeus intervened, lifting his son's immortal spirit to Olympus. Others claim Hercules simply became ash, the price of mixing superhuman deeds with all too human vulnerabilities. Wherever the truth lies, the legendary champion's last mortal breath vanished in baleful fulfilling of the destiny shaped by both triumph and agony. Even the wind seemed to pause in reverence, as though acknowledging that no beast or king had ever broken him as completely as love and betrayal. Hercules' end on Mount Weta thundered through the Greek world like a mournful lament. Those who'd admired him as a liberator stood in stunned silence, while others who had envied him spoke in hushed voices about the cruel caprice of fate. Priests in local temples offered contradictory explanations. Some insisted his spirit rose to the heavens, others deemed it just another tragic demise, albeit of an extraordinary mortal. In the weeks that followed, altars across the Aegean bore solemn offerings in his memory. Drips of wine, handfuls of grain, even small wood carvings depicting a lion's pelt or a hefty club. Ordinary folk struggled to reconcile the downfall of a figure who had bested lions, hydras, and giants. How could such a champion succumb to something as simple, yet devastating, as poisoned fabric? For many, it confirmed that no one, not even a demigod, was immune to the brutal interplay of divine grudges and human failings. At Mycenae, King Eurystheus' court reportedly watched the news unfold with uneasy satisfaction. Though the king had long resented Hercules, learning of his agonizing death offered no genuine relief, only a hollow sense that the realm's most potent shield was gone. Some whispered that if a champion like Hercules could be vanquished, perhaps the gods would turn a harsher eye on lesser mortals. Fear lingered in the corridors of their power, as though Hercules' fiery end had shifted the cosmic balance in unpredictable ways. Stories multiplied, as tales do. Certain bards favoured the uplifting version. Zeus, recognizing his son's heroism, welcomed him among the immortals. They spun visions of Hercules seated on Olympus, sipping ambrosia in the presence of swirling constellations. Others told the bleaker side, that the flames consumed not just his body, but every vestige of his once glorious spirit, scattering him into oblivion. Across the seas, foreign scribes embellished details, turning him into a half-legendary king in lands he never visited. or crediting him with feats he never performed. Amid these tales, Deianira's part in the tragedy sparked endless debate. Some portrayed her as a naive victim of Nessus's deception. Others painted her as a jealous spouse who rashly destroyed what she claimed to love. Still others insisted the real blame lay with the gods. To many listeners, it hardly mattered. Heartbreak had been the final monster Hercules couldn't defeat. Curiously, in small villages scattered near the sites of his labours, Hercules' memory retained a more grounded quality. In these pockets, older farmers recalled how he once repaired a broken dike or rescued a lost child in the midst of a colossal quest. Children heard bedtime stories of a giant who was kind enough to share bread with travellers in need. Here, the heroic feats remained awe-inspiring, but so did the everyday decency he displayed. Over time, that dichotomy, colossal strength paired with unfeigned humility, became the tapestry of his legend. Rulers from other city-states, seeing the potency of Hercules' name, erected shrines dedicated to him as a protective spirit. They wanted travellers to believe their territory enjoyed the hero's blessing. In some cities, small festivals arose, featuring contests of strength reminiscent of his fabled deeds. However, a whisper of caution permeated every public commemoration. Hercules had conquered monstrous beasts and overcome impossible tasks, yet a subtle sting from the mortal realm had undone him. Might alone could not outmaneuver fate or quell the complexities of love. For those who once knew him personally, warriors like Iolaus or local chiefs grateful for his help, his absence left an ache beyond description. They recalled the quiet convictions that guided him, the guilt that shadowed his eyes after each impossible feat. His final torment seemed a cosmic injustice, yet also a stark reminder that the line between divine and human was never clean. Hercules had walked that line throughout his life, wrestling monstrous forms on behalf of the powerless, while an invisible war of deities raged overhead. Over decades, recollections softened. Younger generations heard only the grand arcs, the Nemean lion, the Hydra, the unstoppable hero. Details of heartbreak and moral doubt vanished in the retellings, replaced by carved statues brandishing clubs or wearing lion skins. Yet in rare corners of Greece, the full story was preserved by those who had reason to remember. A titan among men who was neither wholly god nor entirely mortal, undone at last by the same vulnerabilities he had once tried to transcend. Thus, Hercules' flame burned on in the minds of those who found resonance in his struggles, even long after the funeral pyre's embers cooled to ash. Time and distance transformed Hercules from a man into a myth. Greek cities grew, allied and warred. New heroes rose and fell. In the retelling of old stories, his name emerged as a beacon of impossible feats. Philosophers invoked him as a parable, some praising perseverance, others warning against arrogance. In remote villages, older generations passed down more intimate accounts. How a colossal figure once mended a roof before chasing off marauders, or how he accepted a bowl of wine on a cold night without flaunting his stature. As the classical era gave way to Roman ascendancy, Hercules evolved into a Roman emblem. Soldiers prayed to Hercules Invictus, equating him with conquest and unrelenting will. Statues proliferated, from grand marble works in the Forum to tiny household shrines. Emperors, hungry for legitimacy, wrapped themselves in the demigod's imagery, hoping some shred of that timeless prowess might cloak their human frailties. However, the bragging about strength often overshadowed the deeper nuances of Hercules' trials. Centuries later, medieval scholars wrestled with pagan legacy, attempting to blend ancient myths into Christian frameworks. Hercules became a cautionary figure, powerful yet undone by sin and trickery. In the Renaissance, artists seized upon his heroic silhouette. Palaces displayed frescoes of him wrestling lions or heaving mountainsides, highlighting the human form in dynamic glory. Playwrights toyed with his persona, sometimes as tragic hero, sometimes as comedic foil, each era reinterpreting him anew. Despite these cultural metamorphoses, echoes of his true complexity endured. In certain monastic libraries, meticulous scribes noted lesser-known episodes. The moral agony behind his labours, the heartbreak that ended his mortal story, and the persistent question of whether he ever truly found peace. For some, he embodied the tragedy of a life shaped by the divine lineage yet rooted in mortal limitations. For others, he served as a beacon of aspiration, proof that mortal will could confront even the gods' designs and sometimes triumph. Beyond texts and statuary, Hercules lived on in the intangible realm of folk memory. Fishermen off distant coasts recited short prayers to him before braving storms, as if the old guardian might still shield them from the sea's wrath. Caravans crossing desert routes invoked his name for safe passage. Parents, uncertain how to quiet a restless child at night, spun lullabies of a gentle giant who once fought off wolves so families could sleep in safety. These understated tributes carried forward the essence of a hero who, despite divine drama, always answered mortal need. For a contemporary observer, perhaps in the middle decades of life, Hercules' tale resonates on several levels. There's the unbridled strength of youth, those unstoppable surges of ambition or optimism. Then there's the gradual intrusion of responsibility, regret, and heartbreak. Middle age can bring reflection, how even the strongest among us wrestle with past mistakes, unfulfilled desires, and the weight of moral compromise. Hercules, with his unstoppable arms and vulnerable heart, mirrors that universal dilemma. Overall, it's the dualities that define him. Saviour and destroyer, victor and victim, demigod and man. He soared above mortal confines, yet remained shackled by the god's whims and his own remorse. Scholars today still debate the meaning of his final act. Was the funeral pyre a mere surrender to agony, or a deliberate transcendence of mortal bounds? Did the smoke carry him to Olympus, or was it a symbolic final note to the ballad of an exhausted hero? Some epilogues insist he found a measure of immortality, a seat among the pantheon, a cosmic nod to the labours he performed in the service of humanity and divine prerogative. Others claim his spirit roams the mortal realm, occasionally glimpsed in moments of dire need. Most accept that the ultimate truth, like so many ancient tales, remains wrapped in shifting layers of interpretation. And so Hercules remains, a fixture in the collective psyche. He stands for more than might alone. He stands for the cost of greatness, the fleeting nature of redemption, and the fragile boundary that separates gods from men. Whether chiselled in marble or accounted in a village tavern, his legend endures. He is the champion forever, forging new legends, even centuries after his final breath. In that sense, Hercules lives on wherever human hearts still strive, endure, and grapple with the powers, divine or earthly, that shape our destinies. Picture this. You're sitting at home, probably enjoying a lovely cup of wine, and watching your baby son take his first wobbly steps. Life is wonderful. You've got a beautiful wife, a comfortable palace, and your biggest worry is whether the olive harvest will be as good as last year's. Then someone knocks on your door with the ancient world's equivalent of a draft notice. That's precisely what happened to you, Odysseus, when Menelaus showed up at your door around 1194 BC. Now, Menelaus wasn't just any neighbour. He was your brother-in-law's brother, and he had a problem. His wife Helen had run off with a Trojan prince named Paris, and Menelaus wanted her back. He didn't just want her back, he was assembling what would become the largest military expedition in Greek history to retrieve her. But here's the thing about you, Odysseus. You were smart, intelligent. You were intelligent enough to recognise this rescue mission for what it truly was. A 10-year commitment to a war that was likely to end badly for everyone involved. So when Menelaus came calling, you did what any reasonable person would do. You pretended to be crazy. You were not merely eccentric, you fully embraced the role of a method actor. You hitched a donkey and an ox to the same plough, which, if you know anything about farming, is like trying to parallel park with a shopping cart attached to your bumper. Then you started ploughing your fields in zigzag patterns, sowing salt instead of seeds. To anyone watching, you looked like you'd completely lost your marbles. It was actually a pretty brilliant plan. In ancient Greece, crazy people were generally left alone to do their crazy things. No one wanted to conscript the village madman for their holy war. You probably thought you were home free, settling in for a relaxing, peaceful fake insanity while everyone else sailed off to get themselves killed over someone else's marriage problems. But Menelaus hadn't brought just anyone with him. He'd brought Palamedes, who was almost as clever as you were. Palamedes took one look at your performance and knew exactly what you were up to. Therefore, he chose to expose your deception in the most terrifying manner imaginable. He picked up your infant son, Telemachus, your beautiful innocent baby boy, and placed him directly in the path of your crazy plough. Suddenly, you had a choice: maintain your cover and potentially harm your child, or reveal your sanity and get drafted into the Trojan War. Any parent knows there's really no choice at all. You immediately swerved the plough, scooped up little Telemachus, and probably gave Palamedes a look that could have melted bronze. Your cover was blown. Your brilliant plan had lasted all of 5 minutes against a man willing to use your child as a lie detector. And just like that, your quiet life was over. You were now committed to the Trojan War, one of the longest and most dangerous journeys in history. You were too clever for your own good, and someone else was just clever enough to figure you out. As you held your son and looked at the ships waiting in the harbour, you probably had no idea that saying goodbye to your family that day would stretch into a 20-year absence. You believed that you were only facing a difficult year, or possibly 2. Instead, you faced 2 decades of the most unfavourable circumstances any hero has ever encountered. The irony is almost painful. Your intelligence, which made you valuable to the Greek cause, also made you try to avoid it. And your love for your family, which motivated your deception, was precisely what Palamedes used to trap you. You were outsmarted by your best qualities, caught in a web woven from your virtues. So there you were, kissing your wife goodbye and promising you'd be back soon, having no idea that soon would turn into a journey so long and strange that people would still be telling stories about it 3,000 years later. Often, being the most intelligent individual in the room can lead to unfavourable outcomes. If you thought the recruitment process was awful, the actual war was like being stuck in the world's most violent and pointless corporate retreat. The war lasted for a solid decade. Imagine your longest, most frustrating work project. Multiply it by every office politics nightmare you've ever experienced, and then add swords and regular attempts on your life. The Trojan War wasn't like the movies make it seem. There were no quick, decisive battles followed by victory parades. Instead, it was a grinding, decade-long siege that turned into the ancient world's equivalent of the worst camping trip ever. You were stuck on a beach outside Troy's walls, living in tents, eating military rations, and dealing with the egos of heroes who made modern celebrities look humble. Take Achilles, for example. This guy was the greatest warrior who ever lived, and he knew it. He was like having a co-worker who's genuinely brilliant at their job but reminds everyone about it constantly. Except instead of being annoying in meetings, Achilles would sulk in his tent and refuse to fight whenever someone didn't acknowledge his superiority. And when Achilles didn't fight, people died. Many people perished as a result of Achilles' inaction. Then there was Agamemnon, the commander-in-chief, who had all the leadership skills of a particularly stubborn toddler. He'd make decisions based on wounded pride, steal other people's prizes, and generally ensure that every problem took twice as long to solve as it should have. You spent 10 years watching this man turn simple tactical decisions into epic disasters. But here's what really worsened it for you, Odysseus. You were the problem solver. Whenever something went wrong, and something always went wrong, everyone turned to you. Odysseus will figure it out, they'd say. Odysseus is clever. This meant that unlike other heroes who could concentrate on their specific skills, such as Achilles with his fighting or Ajax, who also specialised in fighting, you had to take on multiple roles: the diplomat, the spy, the strategist, and the general crisis manager. You were the one who had to talk Achilles out of his tent when his feelings got hurt. You were the one responsible for devising the secret missions that were conducted behind enemy lines. When they required someone to infiltrate Troy disguised as a beggar to assess their defences, can you guess who was given that prestigious task? Unsurprisingly, it wasn't the guy who dazzled in armour, and the pressure was constant. Every plan had to work, because if it didn't, more of your friends died. Every diplomatic mission was critical, because the alternative was watching the war drag on for another year. You had to be perfect at your job while others had off days. The worst part was that you could see how the war could end, but no one would listen. For years you suggested strategies that might have wrapped things up quickly. However, everyone preferred to proceed in a more difficult and honourable manner, which often resulted in increased casualties. It wasn't until year 10 that you finally convinced them to try your most famous idea, the Trojan horse. Even then, gaining approval was a challenging task. Hide inside a giant wooden horse and sneak into the city, they said. That's ridiculous. But they were desperate enough by then to try ridiculous things. Of course, it worked perfectly. You'd known it would work, you'd been thinking about it for years. One night of clever strategy accomplished what a decade of straightforward fighting couldn't. Troy fell, Helen was recovered, and suddenly everyone was ready to go home and tell stories about their glorious victory. You probably thought the hard part was over. You'd survived 10 years of war, outsmarted the Trojans, and helped end the longest siege in history. It was now time to sail home to Ithaca, embrace your wife and son, and perhaps indulge in a lengthy bath. The journey home was supposed to be the easy part, just a few weeks of sailing across familiar waters. You had no way of knowing that the war, awful as it was, would be the relaxing part of your story. At least during the war you were surrounded by allies, you had regular meals, and the enemies were clearly marked and fighting fair. The journey ahead would make 10 years of war look like a pleasant vacation. As you sailed away from the burning ruins of Troy, likely feeling confident in your cleverness and eagerly anticipating the comfort of your bed, you were unaware that you had just exchanged one nightmare for another, and this next nightmare wouldn't have any fellow heroes to help you through it. Sailing home from Troy should have been straightforward. It's not like you were navigating uncharted waters. These were well-known Mediterranean routes that Greek ships had been using for centuries. Think of it as taking the interstate home after a long business trip. You know the way, you've done it before. What could possibly go wrong? As it turned out, everything went wrong. Absolutely everything. Your first major mistake happened right after leaving Troy, and it perfectly captures why being you was such a special kind of torture. See, you just spent 10 years being the smart guy, the one with all the plans, the hero who solved impossible problems. Your confidence was likely at its peak. So when you spotted the island of the Cyclopes, instead of sailing past like a sensible person, you decided to stop and explore. Now, any reasonable travel advisor would have told you that an island full of one-eyed giants was probably not the best place for a shore excursion. But you were curious, and curiosity was both your greatest strength and your most dangerous weakness. You wanted to see what Cyclops hospitality was like. Let me warn you, the experience was dreadful. You and your men ended up trapped in the cave of Polyphemus, a Cyclops who had all the charm of a grouchy bouncer and the table manners of a garbage disposal. This guy didn't just threaten to eat you, he actually started doing it, grabbing your men 2 at a time like they were appetizers at a very dark cocktail party. But here's where your intelligence saved you and doomed you at the same time. You came up with a brilliant escape plan. Get Polyphemus drunk, tell him your name was nobody, blind him with a sharpened stake, then escape by hiding under his sheep. It was clever, original, and it worked perfectly. However, it didn't work as planned. Because as you were sailing away, safe and sound, and probably feeling pretty pleased with yourself, you made the kind of mistake that would haunt you for the next 10 years. Instead of keeping your mouth shut and counting your blessings, you had to turn around and shout your real name at the Cyclops. "I am Odysseus," you yelled across the water. "Son of Laertes, king of Ithaca, remember that name." It was like escaping from a bank robbery and then stopping to hand the security guard your business card. Polyphemus, being the son of Poseidon, oh yes, you'd just blinded the sea god's favourite child, immediately called Daddy and asked for revenge. And Poseidon, who controlled every wave between you and home, was more than happy to oblige. Just like that, your journey home became a decade-long nightmare of divine harassment. This is what made being you so uniquely awful. Your greatest strengths kept turning into your worst enemies. Your curiosity got you into the trouble, your intelligence got you out of it, and then your pride got you into much worse trouble. It was like being trapped in a cosmic feedback loop designed by a particularly sadistic philosophy professor. From that point on, every day at sea was a new flavour of misery. Poseidon would whip up storms whenever you tried to make progress. Your ships would be sailing along nicely, and suddenly you'd find yourself in waves the size of apartment buildings, with winds that seemed personally angry at you. It was like having the world's worst commute, except instead of traffic jams, you got supernatural disasters, and the crew started to get nervous. These were experienced sailors who'd survived the Trojan War, but even they began to wonder if maybe their captain had angered the wrong god, which of course you had. Every time lightning split the sky or a wave threatened to capsize your ship, you could practically hear them thinking, maybe we should have stayed home and pretended to be crazy too. The really maddening part was that you could see other ships sailing by without any problems. Poseidon's grudge was specifically against you. Other sailors were having perfectly normal voyages while you couldn't go 5 miles without encountering some maritime disaster that violated several laws of physics. You were starting to realise that getting home wasn't going to be just difficult, it was going to require surviving whatever creative punishments an angry god could dream up. And Poseidon, as it turned out, had a very good imagination and a very long memory. The son you'd left as a baby was growing up without you. Your wife was dealing with increasingly aggressive suitors, and your kingdom was slowly falling apart, all because you couldn't resist solving one more puzzle and then bragging about it. If you've ever been on a vacation where everything that could go wrong did go wrong, you might sympathise with what happened next. Except your vacation was actually a desperate attempt to get home, and instead of lost luggage and overbooked hotels, you were dealing with monsters, witches, and divine intervention designed specifically to ruin your day. Take your stop at Aea, the island of Circe. Now, Circe was a witch, not the harmless crystal-collecting kind, but the turns men into pigs variety. When your advanced scout team went to explore her palace, they came back as actual swine, not metaphorically. Your crew's men were oinking and rooting in the dirt, which was probably not what they signed up for. So there you were, faced with another impossible situation that somehow became your responsibility to fix. Everyone looked at you like, well, Odysseus, you're the clever one. How do we turn pigs back into people? It seemed as though this was a common issue that any sane captain should be capable of resolving. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, Hermes showed up with a solution, a magical herb called moly that would protect you from Circe's magic. But here's the thing about divine assistance, it always comes with strings attached. Hermes didn't just hand you the herb and wish you luck. Hermes provided you with detailed instructions, essentially instructing you to seduce the witch without allowing her to seduce you back, and to persuade her to assist you instead of transforming you into livestock. This task was like being told to negotiate a business deal with someone who had already demonstrated they preferred to turn negotiating partners into farm animals. The stress level was not insignificant. Amazingly, it worked. You managed to resist Circe's magic, convince her to restore your men, and somehow turn her into an ally instead of an enemy. She even gave you crucial advice about the dangers ahead. You were probably feeling pretty good about your diplomatic skills at this point. Then came the part that should have been a red flag the size of a small country. Circe told you that to get home, you'd need to visit the underworld and consult the dead prophet Tiresias, not send a message to, or ask someone else to check with. You personally had to go to the land of the dead and have a chat with ghosts. Let that sink in for a moment. Your GPS directions home included a literal trip to hell. The underworld wasn't like the cosy afterlife you might imagine from movies. It was a grim, grey place filled with the shades of everyone who had ever died, all of them desperate to drink blood so they could remember what it felt like to be alive. You had to perform sacrifices to attract the spirits, then try to have coherent conversations with dead people while surrounded by the moaning souls of everyone who had ever lived and died. And the advice you got? Tiresias basically told you that your journey was going to be even worse than you'd imagined. Poseidon was still furious. You'd face temptations that would destroy your crew, and even if you made it home, you'd find your house full of men trying to marry your wife and steal your kingdom. After all that, you'd have to go on another epic odyssey to appease Poseidon. It felt akin to visiting a fortune teller who foretold a future filled with natural disasters, familial issues and endless journeys. You were still attempting to recuperate from the present natural calamities, familial issues, and unwelcome journeys. But the underworld visit did give you one thing: perspective. You saw the shadows of your fallen comrades from Troy, including Achilles, who uttered a quote that likely encapsulated your entire situation. I'd rather be alive and serving someone else than dead and ruling over all these shadows. Even the greatest hero of your generation was saying that any life, no matter how difficult, was better than being dead. Depending on how you viewed your current situation, it could be both comforting and terrifying. As you sailed away from the underworld, back toward the world of the living, you probably realised that you were only halfway through your trials. Every solution led to new problems, every ally gave you advice that made your journey longer and more dangerous, and every display of cleverness seemed to paint an even bigger target on your back. The dead had confirmed what you were starting to suspect. The problem wasn't just bad luck or divine displeasure. This was a test designed by the universe itself, and the passing grade was somehow surviving long enough to see home again. After your charming vacation in the underworld, you might have thought the worst was behind you. You'd talked to dead people, received prophetic warnings, and survived a literal trip to hell. Surely the path ahead would be relatively straightforward, right? This type of optimism makes your existence a uniquely torturous experience. Next up on your magical mystery tour of Mediterranean misery were the sirens, creatures whose voices were so beautiful and persuasive that they could lure any sailor to crash their ship on the rocks just to get closer to the music. They were like the ancient world's version of a honey trap, except instead of corporate espionage, the stakes were death by shipwreck. Now, most sailors dealt with the sirens by either avoiding their waters entirely or putting wax in their ears and hoping for a better outcome. But you, being you, couldn't resist the intellectual challenge. You wanted to hear the siren's song and survive it. You aspired to be the first individual to encounter this legendary temptation and emerge victorious. So you came up with another one of your elaborate plans. Have your crew tie you to the mast, wax up their ears so they couldn't hear anything, and sail right past the sirens while you listened to their song. You made them promise to keep you tied up until you were safe, no matter how much you begged, pleaded, or threatened. It was actually a pretty brilliant solution to an impossible problem. Classic Odysseus, finding the clever third option that no one else had thought of. The plan worked perfectly, which somehow worsened it. The siren song was everything you'd been told it would be, absolutely irresistible, promising you knowledge and understanding beyond anything mortals were meant to possess. You spent the entire encounter straining against your ropes, begging your crew to let you go, probably saying things you'd be embarrassed about later. Your crew, to their credit, followed orders and kept you tied up until the danger passed. But the experience made you aware of what you lacked, which is worse than ignorance. You tasted forbidden knowledge and survived, but the memory of what you couldn't have probably haunted you for years. And that was just the warm-up act. Next came the Strait of Messina, where you had to choose between Scylla and Charybdis, literally the origin of the phrase between a rock and a hard place. On one side was Scylla, a six-headed monster who would snatch sailors from passing ships. On the other was Charybdis, a massive whirlpool that could suck entire vessels down to the ocean floor. This wasn't a puzzle you could solve with cleverness. It was pure horrible mathematics. Lose 6 men to Scylla, or risk losing everyone to Charybdis. There was no third option, no creative solution, no way to outsmart the situation. You had to choose which of your men would die. You chose Scylla because losing 6 was better than losing everyone. It was the right tactical decision, the logical choice, the option that saved the most lives. It was also the kind of choice that haunts you forever. You had to watch 6 of your companions, men who had followed you through 10 years of war and years of wandering, get snatched away by a monster while you sailed past, unable to save them. This is what made your journey uniquely torturous. It wasn't enough that you faced impossible challenges. You had to make impossible choices. Your intelligence meant you could see all the options, understand all the consequences, and live with the knowledge that every decision came at a cost measured in human lives. However, the universe had not yet finished with you. Your final test came at the island of the sun god, where Helios kept his sacred cattle. Circe had warned you about this place. Whatever you do, don't let your men eat the cattle. It seemed simple enough. Avoid consuming the revered cows. How hard could that be? It turned out to be very hard when storms trapped you on the island for weeks, your food supplies ran out, and your starving crew looked at those fat, healthy cattle and started doing math of their own. While you were off praying to the gods for help, your men made a choice. Better to risk divine punishment than die of hunger. They killed and ate the sacred cattle. When you returned and smelled the roasting meat, you knew immediately what had happened. Your men had just signed everyone's death warrant, including yours. The sun god demanded justice, and Zeus was happy to provide it in the form of a lightning bolt that destroyed your ship and killed everyone aboard. However, this fate did not extend to you. You summoned by clinging to debris, watching your remaining companions drown, knowing that their deaths were the direct result of following you on this cursed journey. After years of keeping your crew alive through impossible dangers, you'd finally reached a situation where your cleverness couldn't save them, and now you were completely alone, floating in the sea with nothing but your regrets for company. Washing up on Calypso's island might have seemed like good luck at first. After watching your entire crew die and spending days clinging to wreckage in the open ocean, finding yourself on a beautiful tropical paradise with a goddess who wanted to take care of you probably felt like winning the lottery. Calypso was, by all accounts, stunningly beautiful, magically powerful, and completely infatuated with you. She promised you immortality, perpetual youth, and a luxurious life on her idyllic island. All you had to do was give up your obsession with getting home and accept that your old life was over. For most people, this would have been an effortless choice. Your wife hadn't seen you in nearly 20 years. Your son was grown up and didn't really know you. Your kingdom probably assumed that you were dead. Why not begin anew with a goddess who could provide you with everything? But here's what made being you so particularly agonizing. You couldn't stop thinking. You couldn't just accept the easy happiness being offered to you. Your mind kept working, planning, and remembering what you'd lost and what you still hoped to find. So instead of paradise, Calypso's island became a beautiful prison. Every day was the same: perfect weather, incredible scenery, a goddess who wanted to spend time with you, and the growing certainty that you were slowly going insane from homesickness. Calypso couldn't understand why you weren't content. From her perspective, she was offering you the best possible life. She saved you from drowning, gave you everything you wanted, and offered to make you immortal. What more could a mortal want? What you wanted was the one thing she couldn't give you, the choice to leave. This went on for 7 years. For 7 years you experienced beautiful sunsets that reminded you of the sunsets over Ithaca. 7 years of comfortable beds that weren't your bed. 7 years of pleasant conversation with someone who wasn't your wife. The 7 years in paradise evoked a sense of exile, as it didn't feel like home. You spent those years sitting on the beach staring at the horizon, probably driving yourself crazy with questions that had no answers. Was Penelope still alive? Had she remarried? Was Telemachus ruling Ithaca now? Did anyone remember that you'd once been a king, a hero, a husband and a father? The worst part was that you couldn't even properly hate Calypso. She wasn't evil like the Cyclops or monstrous like Scylla. She genuinely cared about you and couldn't understand why her love wasn't enough. She was trying to give you happiness, and your rejection of that happiness hurt her feelings, so you were trapped not just by divine power, but by guilt. Every day you spent longing for home was a day you were essentially telling this goddess that her perfect love wasn't good enough for you. Which, technically, it wasn't. But explaining that to someone who could turn you into a tree if she got frustrated required considerable diplomatic skill. The psychological torture was exquisite. You were surrounded by everything most people would consider happiness, and you were miserable. You had the love of a goddess, and you wanted the love of a mortal woman you hadn't seen in decades. You were being offered immortality, and you wanted to go home to grow old and die. It was like being offered the perfect job in a city you hated, or being given a mansion in a place where you didn't know anyone. It was both objectively wonderful and subjectively unbearable. And through it all, you had no idea if your suffering meant anything. You didn't know if the gods were testing you, punishing you, or just forgot about you. You didn't know if Penelope was faithfully waiting or if she'd moved on with her life. You were making this enormous sacrifice, turning down paradise for the possibility of home, without any guarantee that home still existed. Home, the only thing keeping you sane, was the same thing that had gotten you into this mess. Your stubborn, relentless intelligence. You couldn't stop thinking, couldn't stop planning, and couldn't stop believing that somehow, eventually, you'd find a way home. Even when home felt like a dream you'd had once, long ago in another life, before you'd learned that the price of being clever was being trapped forever in the consequences of your cleverness. After 7 years of this beautiful torture, rescue finally came from an unexpected source. The gods themselves had grown bored with your situation and decided to intervene. It was pleasant, yet it resulted in you being imprisoned in paradise for 7 years, simply because the divine powers had momentarily forgotten your existence. When Athena finally convinced Zeus to let you leave Calypso's island, you probably thought your troubles were nearly over. Sure, you still had to cross the sea on a makeshift raft, and yes, Poseidon got in one last shot by wrecking your boat just before you reached land, but you'd survived worse. The coast of Phaeacia looked like salvation itself. The Phaeacians were the ancient world's version of an incredibly helpful neighbour, always equipped with the appropriate tool and never posing awkward questions. They fed you, listened to your entire story, which took quite a while to tell, gave you gifts, and then provided you with a magic ship that could sail faster than thought itself. Finally, you were returning home in luxury. However, this is where your situation reached peak cruel irony. After 20 years of desperate struggle to return home, you slept through the moment of your actual arrival. The Phaeacians left you and their gifts on Ithaca's beach and sailed away before you woke up. You literally missed your homecoming. When you finally opened your eyes, you didn't even recognize your island. Athena had disguised the landscape to protect you, but for a few horrible moments, you thought the Phaeacians had dumped you in the wrong place. After everything you'd been through, the possibility that you were still lost was almost enough to break your spirit entirely. Once Athena revealed herself and explained the situation, you discovered that your problems were far from over. Your house was full of suitors, 108 men who had moved in, eaten your food, drunk your wine, and spent years pressuring your wife to choose one of them as her new husband. Your son Telemachus was angry and grown, your servants were split between loyal and traitorous, and your kingdom was on the verge of civil war. This wasn't the homecoming you'd imagined during those long years of exile. You dreamed of walking through your own front door, hugging your family, and settling back into peaceful domestic life. Instead, you found yourself planning what amounted to a military operation to reclaim your own home, and you had to do it carefully. These weren't monsters or gods you were dealing with. They were the sons of noble families, men with relatives who would demand justice if they were killed. You couldn't just storm in with your sword swinging. You needed a plan that would eliminate the threat while giving you legal and moral cover for what was essentially going to be a massacre in your own dining room. So you disguised yourself as a beggar, again with the disguises, and spent days infiltrating your own house, gathering intelligence about your enemies while being treated like garbage by men who were stealing your property. You had to watch your servants abuse strangers in your home, listen to the suitors mock your memory, and see how they treated your wife and son. The psychological strain must have been incredible. You were home, finally home, but you couldn't reveal yourself to the people you loved most. You had to watch Penelope's pain without being able to comfort her, see Telemachus's anger without being able to guide him, and observe the destruction of everything you'd built without being able to stop it. Even your reunion with Penelope was complicated. She'd survived 20 years of pressure, threats, and uncertainty by becoming cautious and clever herself. When you finally revealed who you were, she tested you to make sure you were really her husband and not some god or shapeshifter playing out a cruel trick. After decades of dealing with deception, she couldn't trust even the man she'd waited for. The final confrontation with the suitors was brutal and effective. With help from Telemachus and a few loyal servants, you killed all 108 men in a single afternoon. It was tactically brilliant and morally justified, but it was also mass murder in your own home. The magnificent hall where you'd once entertained guests was now full of corpses, and even then it wasn't over. The families of the dead suitors wanted revenge, naturally enough. You'd eliminated one threat only to create another. It took divine intervention from Athena to prevent your homecoming from starting a civil war that would have destroyed the kingdom you'd fought so hard to reclaim. After 20 years of being Odysseus the wanderer, the survivor, the clever hero who could overcome any obstacle, you were finally back to being Odysseus, the king, the husband, and the father. But those roles didn't fit quite the same way anymore. You'd changed, your family had changed, and your kingdom had changed. Home was still home, but it wasn't the same home you'd left. The man who once confidently taunted a Cyclops had learned about the cost of intelligence, the burden of survival, and the price of getting what you wish for. You were home, but you were also carrying 20 years of impossible choices, lost friends, and memories that would never quite let you rest. Sometimes the hardest part of any journey isn't reaching your destination. It's figuring out how to live there once you've arrived. After everything you'd been through, that final challenge might have been the most difficult of all. But at least you were finally home. And sometimes, even when home isn't quite what you remembered, it's still exactly where you belong.